Well, thank you everyone very much for being here. I'm Ilaria Cimadori. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Yale School of the Environment, and I work with Professor Gerald Torres. And I'm really excited to moderate this panel today, since it's a topic very dear to me. And the panel is entitled Gene Editing in Livestock Industry, Justice Implication for Farming Systems and Non-Human Animals. We have only 1 hour together, and we are going to pack a lot of insights from this hour. But please also go ahead and get your questions ready. And we're going to take those at the end of the session, the discussion, sorry. And those that attend virtually can drop the questions in the Q&A. So I think I'll start with introducing our fantastic panelists today. Luis Camargo is a researcher at the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, Embrapa, and his research is focused in reproductive biotechnologies applied to in vitro embryo production and embryo development, and genetic engineering and gene editing in embryos of domestic species. Professor Frewer is chair of Food and Society at Newcastle University, and her research interests focus on understanding food systems, developing effective risk and benefit communication strategies with consumers, agri-food governance, and she recently focused on gene editing on animals from a consumer and a citizen perspective. So please give a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much. Now, please join me also in welcoming Professor Camargo remarks. And if you would like to share your screen, Professor.
Yeah, so it's going to start, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I thank you very much for the invitation, right? I think this is an opportunity we can have to discuss our thoughts here with different people where I used to do. So let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is moving?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So let's start that. I'm going to talk a little bit about this new breeding technologies. Gene editing is one of them. But the new breeding technologies for cattle in tropical and subtropical regions. Before start talking about this technology, I want to take you to the context of dairy production in tropical and subtropical regions. Why dairy production? Because I'm working in a corporation and a governmental corporation that work with dairy cattle. I grew up in the dairy farming. So yeah, I know how hard these people have been trying to get some to surviving milking cows, you know. So let's start with that. So first of all, I want to show you that you have to remember that about 80% of the cattle populations is located in tropical and subtropical regions. So we can see here in the just show this in the South American, Brazil, part of Brazil, Central America, Africa, India, China. The largest cattle populations is in India and Brazil, and then United States and Europe. I also want to show you that about 40% of the human population are in the tropical and subtropical regions. So if you look at here in the map, also you can see this here, right? So high population in sub-Saharan African countries, in Brazil, in India, and China. And the thing is that those nations in the tropical and subtropical regions, they have the highest growth rate, mainly in Africa and in Asia, and also the poorest nations. So we have a situation here. We have a large cattle population with a lot of human living in the tropical and subtropical regions, and with a highest growth rate in the just few money, right? With very poor people living there. So about cattle farming in the tropics. So we can find in the tropics large farms So it's the case of Brazil and Australia for beef cattle. So you have even in the north of Argentina, you can find large farms like that picture here in the on the right. But most of the farm are smallholders or small farmers, and most of them are dairy farms. So they have usually between 1, 15, some of them a little bit more. In Brazil, for instance, between 15 and 20 cows. The milk yield usually is lesser than 3 and 5 kilos per day per cow. So if you have five cows with 5 kilos per day, so this is about 20 kilos, 15, 20 kilos per day. The milk usually is for self-consuming, to make some cheese, and also to make some money when they sell the extra liters, right? So we have some pictures from Brazil here, from Africa, right? So let's now make a comparison on milk yield per cow and considering different countries. Let's consider here the largest milk producers, United States. So it's this larger milk producer, USA, right? Then we have the India, Brazil, the third large milk producer. Then you have China, you have Germany, the other European countries here. So let's make a comparison between the productivity between United States and India, right? In the United States, a cow can, in average, produce 9,000 kilos per lactation. That's a lot of milk. And in India, it's about 1,300 kilos, right? So a North American cow, right, can produce 7 times more milk than an Indian cow, than a cow in India. This is the same situation in Brazil. Since Brazil, a North American cow can produce 5 times more milk than the average than the Brazilian cow here, right? And we have to keep in mind that Brazil and India have the largest cattle population. So a lot of cows producing pink milk, just few milk, right? But what are the reasons of this kind of difference in milk production between United States, Europe, some countries in Europe, and India, Africa, and Brazil, for instance? The main factor is the environmental one, right? So we have the high temperature, the humidity. This is it's a well-known feature of the tropical and subtropical regions, right? So we have the heat stress, tropical diseases, parasites. The availability and quality of food is also a problem. We have also a breed effect, right? So we have local breeds, the African cows, or zebu cows. They're an Indian one. They are well adapted to the environment, to this kind of tropical region, right? But the milk production is low. There is no genetic improvement program for those animals, or if they are still young. This is the case here in Brazil. We have a program for the gear cattle, which is just 25 years, a little bit more than 25 years old. But you have also the exotic breeds, the European cows. Those cows have a high productivity, right? When they are in Europe, when they're in USA, when the UK, even in Argentina, New Zealand. So we have a high productivity. But when those kind of cows are in the tropical region, they suffer a lot with the heat stress. So they are not adapted to this kind of tropical. So at the end, the result is exotic breeds suffering from diseases, heat stress, if a low milk production. That situation can become worse if you consider the global warming. So if you think that if you consider that global warming is going really to happen, right? So the nations located in the tropical regions, they will be affected more strongly than other regions. And then we have another problem. We already have a problem with heat stress, and now that problem can become worse, right? So the results of this low productivity in tropical and subtropical regions is a high pressure on land usage. So milk being produced from an increasing number of low production cows, a lot of cows, right? High methane emission per unit of milk produced. So a lot of cows, again, producing just a lower volume of milk. A low population income, when those population depends on the milk. So no or just few extra liters milk to be sold to the market. And with this low milk availability, those nations had to import milk. So this can increase the prices of the milk, and then we can have a food security problem. Even Brazil is the third milk producer, we still have to import milk, right? How we can boost the milk production? We can do different things to do that, but we need one thing that we need is a well-oriented application of animal management and technologies. So we need animal nutrition, animal health, animal welfare. We have to offer this to the farmers, regardless the size, if the size of the herd, if it's 2 or 3 cows or 20 or 30 cows, right? We need genetic improvement programs to select the best animal. We can use reproductive biotechnology like artificial insemination. We can use this to disseminate semen or embryos from the best animals, right? Yeah, one thing that have been done in those tropical regions is the crossbreeding. So cross European cattle with local breeds. European cattle, high productivity, with local breeds, well adapted to the environment. With that, we have the heterosis effect. So
Professor,
that means that
you have 2 minutes left.
okay, the progenitors show the better qualities than the parents. So what we can do, so let's move in here faster, right? I'm gonna give you 2 examples how we can use genome editors for those animals, right? One of them is to enhance milk production in zebu cows. We can use genome editors to move an allele here. The allele A is one allele that is associated with milk yield in Holstein and Jersey cattle. We can move this allele using genome editors from Holstein to Gyr. So we don't need to cross them, right? To cross Holstein with Gyr. We just move one allele, right? We can do, this is the situation here. We can move one allele from, this is the allele A. This is allele that was found in Holstein and Gyr. We use the genome editor to move this allele to Gyr. So we can increase 5–10% the milk of this cow. So instead of 8 liters per day, they can produce maybe 9 liters per day. So this is 10% is a lot, right? We can use genome editors to move alleles from a cow that's adapted to the environment. This is the case here for the caracal cow. This is a Brazilian one. We have a allele called this lake 2. So those cows are more tolerant to heat stress, but produce low milk. So we can use the genome editors to move just one base, to change one base here, nucleotide C to T, to Angus, or even to Holstein cattle, right? So we don't need to cross caracal with Angus or caracal with Cross. We can move only one allele and make this Holstein cows a little bit more tolerant. It's not the final solution, but can give them more a condition to reduce the heat stress. Well, so to finish that, I want to say that for tropical and subtropical regions, we have a great plantation to produce milk that can improve the livelihood of those people. We need to consider regional factors. We can apply the technology that are already available. One of these is the precision breeding. When you have the right target, so maybe we can the precision breeding can help to increase the milk production, maybe 10%, 15%. But we think the amount of cows we have there, so that will be very useful for this. But the main thing is that we need partnership among nations, institutions that are in the tropics. So this is one problem that we have here in the tropics. So nations trying to work alone, right? Or maybe depending from the institutions from temperate countries. So we need to find the solution for our own problems. We need cooperation for everyone, but who is interested in to find a solution for my problem is here in Brazil, for instance, is the Brazilian one, right? So but as we have this similar conditions with Africa and Asia, thinking tropical regions, so we need this kind of collaboration and sharing knowledge. So thank you very much. I'm not sorry if I use more my time. Oh, that's what it means.
No worries, Professor. Muito obrigada. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now, please, Professor Fruer, if you would like also to share your screen.
Okay, give me a moment.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bear with me a second.
Mhm.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm taking a very different perspective. I'm thinking about societal perspectives on gene editing and animal production systems. And I just went to the internet to see what's happening, what's the discussion about some of these issues. So on one hand, we find out about the benefits of gene editing technologies. At the same time, I guess there are concerns about some of the social and ethical issues. And I'm just drawing your attention to this UK Nuffield Council on Bioethics report on genome editing and farmed animal breeding, which was published earlier this year, where a lot of these ethical issues were discussed. There are profound differences between expert and citizen perceptions of risk, but also how they evaluate ethics. And this may vary across cultures, it may vary according to context. But what I want to just point out, if you go to this green highlighted area, that first of all, the way we respond to issues in an emotional or an affective way determines how we think about them. The more we are concerned about the moral and ethical assessments and how these are made, the more it might influence our decision making, and also the extent to which we trust regulators and the information which is provided. The more we trust scientists, and I include myself as a scientist here, the more we may react in a different way to what's being said. I'd like to go back to think of about some of the issues associated with genetic modification. And in many parts of the world, there was a very negative response to GM. This is the results of a meta-analysis summarized that was published in 2013. The one I really want to highlight is at the top in terms of the results, that plant-related or general applications were more acceptable than animal-related applications everywhere in the world where data were collected. And in general, if we go to the second point, pharmaceutical production was much more acceptable than food-related applications. However, I don't necessarily argue here that people extrapolate their attitudes towards gene editing from those that they associate with the genetic modification. And this is the results of some qualitative research conducted in the UK, where people were most negative about gene drives and GM foods. In the middle, gene editing, conservation genomics, and were more positive about accelerated breeding with no cisgenics or transgenics and traditional breeding. So gene editing is kind of in the middle, but I think that oversimplifies the discussion. So priorities and concerns expressed by people were very similar in terms, if you like, those qualitative factors which were driving opinion. So what drives concern? Perceived unnaturalness is very important. The telos, the qualities of the animal that make it an animal. The assessment of whether there are alternative approaches available to deal with the issue at hand. Certainly in our data, animal welfare was an important priority. Ethical concerns also emerged as a priority. So the issue of disenhancement, for example, polling cattle, or potentially turning off stress mechanisms to increase the intensification in production systems, was a real problem for many people. There was also a general disquiet about changing animals for our own uses. So many questions, I suppose, arose in this research about whether gene editing was being applied for financial gain, whether it would result in intensification of animal production systems. People were more positive about improvements to animal health rather than productivity, and the reduced negative environmental impacts, for example, in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. But what I want to say here is all of these concerns are potentially a tipping point for acceptance of gene-edited animals. It could go either way. And it's the way people think about benefits, the way they perceive benefits, or they perceive some of these moral issues, which will drive their responses. So I've just put up a few questions here. Is the telos of farmed animals important, the animalness of the animal? Should we use gene editing to reduce animal diseases? Or should we just apply gene editing to reduce animal diseases in intensive systems? What about improving human health at the expense, if you like, of animal welfare? I have a question here. Should we regulate against gene editing, which allows increased intensification of animal production systems, turning off animal emotions such as stress so we can raise them more intensively, inhibiting animal behaviors to increase production? Is that a good thing? Should we be eating and producing so much animal protein when there may be alternatives available? We need to consider the disparities in food security between low to middle income countries and more affluent countries. But is producing more animal-based food through intensification the solution? At the same time, are we about to produce a disadvantaged group of people, smallholder farmers in LMICs, who don't have access to gene editing technologies? I pointed out that people are quite positive about gene editing to reduce the environmental impacts of production, for example, in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. But the issue is, of course, is reducing animal production per se a better option? Should we consider alternatives, plant-based proteins, insect proteins, and cultured meat? And of course, there's a whole set of issues about transparency and consumer choice, labeling. And as a citizen, rather than a consumer, can we express our preferences for the adoption of gene-edited animals in terms of regulations and how these influence farming practices? So I'll stop my share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, professors. Thank you both. These were very interesting presentations. But now let's move a little bit to go more in depth to some of the points that you raised during your presentation. So I have a question. Professor Camargo mentioned that this may be really useful for smallholder farmers to increase production, like gene editing cattle in this case. But I was wondering if do smallholder farmers show interest in using this technology, and would it be widely available to low to middle income countries?
Yeah, I can answer or try to answer these questions. You know, people usually try to usually want to say that technology is not for smallholders. So of course, depends, right? I can say that they will be interested. Actually, they are already, for some depending on the technology. For genome editing, we shouldn't have this on the field, so I cannot say that they will be interested or not. But if you use a technology to improve their lives, they will be interested. We have to remember that when you use the technology, this kind of technology for crops is different for animals. For crops, the farmer has to buy the seeds every season, every time. In that case, here now it can buy semen from a bull, but then then you have the sire on the farm, and then have and then he can keep the allele, for instance, the anything in his herd. So, but I think that's we don't have an example saying that because we don't have this on the field now, different from plants. But I think yes, because they don't need to have a large herd to use this kind of technology.
Thank you. Professor Freire, you have any further comments?
Well, only that using a technological push because it's available may not be the only solution in terms of environmental justice. Because we can, does that mean we should? Should we consider a range of alternatives? What other ways can we think of to reduce some of these inequalities? I can think, for example, that improvements in precision agriculture in terms of farming, reducing disease through using observational methods, for example, might also something that can be considered. And I know this is available at very low cost and being rolled out in sub-Saharan Africa. So a mono solution to a problem may not be the only one that we should address.
Yeah, thank you. And actually connected to this, I have another question, because there is also some, like, even considering, like, should we use it or not? Would actually smallholders feel obliged, or like, would they feel like they have to use this technology to stay competitive?
Should I answer the first part of that? I think we have to find out. We have to ask them. Do they feel pressured to adopting particular technological solutions because people in affluent countries are saying that this is, what they're using? Or should we perhaps look at a more culturally nuanced approach? That's the first thing. And then the other thing I'm going to say is, should we be intensifying some of these systems at all in affluent countries through gene editing or other approaches to optimizing food security? Professor
Camargo?
Yeah. So first I want to agree with Dr. Freire. That's about saying that there is no mono solution for everything. This is clear. We cannot do that. This if you do it, you'll be a problem in the end. And with that, I can jump to your second question about to feel obligated. So we have an example for some few countries in Africa when some smallholders start to use AI, artificial insemination, without anyone to support them, right? But just because some maybe large farmers was using, or maybe was a government, I don't remember exactly, when they started using that, that was not the final solution for their problems. And now they are not using AI. They don't want AI because they started using. They didn't have a solution because it was sold to them that the AI would be the final solution. This is not the thing, right? So I think you will not feel obligated to use this. If they start, you have to ask them. But if you start using this, if it doesn't work, any kind of technology, they will quit it.
Mhm. Yes, thank you very much. And actually, something else emerged very important from both your presentations is also the importance of animal welfare, right? And it has been explained that gene editing can help with certain animal welfare issues like the horning cattle or gene editing pigs so that they don't grow tails and hence they mitigate tail biting. But would this, as Professor Fu was also starting to introduce, would this actually may move farmers towards more increased intensification of animal production, given that some of the welfare concerns have been partially addressed?
So shall I answer that first, and then see what Dr. Camargo has to say about that? I think there is societal disquiet about, first of all, changing animal characteristics to make them less of the animal that they are, the telos, but also, I suppose, changing those characteristics to enable the intensification of production systems in a way which would only be possible because of these changes. So, for example, if you gene edit or genetically modify animals so that they don't have emotional or affective responses to their environment, why do we have the power to do that, to exploit those animals? Don't those animals in themselves have those responses because of their animalness, but also to allow them to survive? So, is that a big ethical issue that we need to think about? The other issue that many people raise is that we're changing something that then cannot be reversed. It's an irreversible change. And the decisions that we're making now will have long-term consequences for animal welfare into the future, when we may think very differently about what animal welfare is, what is good about it, and what really we shouldn't be doing.
Professor Camargo?
Yeah. Let's see if I understood well the question. But yeah, we can the issues about using genome editing to increase the animal welfare, but you can have the opposite also. Is that the question, right?
Yeah, it's more like if you remove some of the concerns about welfare, right? Would this make farmers move more to a more intensified farming? Because it's like, okay, they don't bite their tails anymore, let's say, then we can confine them even further.
It may happen. I think all of this depend also where you are. Depend where and people you are working to. For instance, when you say intensification, depend where you are. Intensification is 10-20% more producing is just like I'm giving the example of milk. It's just 1 liter. It can give you a big difference for the people. But that's not the case for Europe, for instance, or United States. If you increase 10% of cow, they produce 9,000 kilos per day. That would be it's not logical, right? So you can use this according to the where you want the countries you really need it, right? And about the animal welfare, we can use, in my opinion, you can use gene editing to reduce, to improve animal health, maybe to make them have a better life. If you think that you can use this for human, you can also use this for animals also. But of course, in both ways, regardless if human for animal, you have to take all factors in consideration, all problems or issues. It's just you're gonna just use it because I want that. So yeah, you have to look in both sides.
Yeah, so also, also Professor Freer was, and we talked about the further instrumentalization and also connected to welfare. I was wondering, do you think that increasing productivity traits, like in this case, increasing milk production in cattle, would affect their animal welfare? Like, do you think that the two things can coexist, productivity and welfare, or when you pursue productivity traits, you are actually losing animal welfare?
I'm going to chip in here.
Sure.
It's not a question of whether, it's a question of should we be doing this? Is this exploiting animals to a degree which is unacceptable? I guess because there are other technological and not technological approaches to optimizing food security, to make our food systems more resistant, more resilient to system shocks, which do not involve necessarily increasing the availability of animal protein in the global food system. And they may be more environmentally friendly. They may not compromise animal welfare because more animals are not involved. So this is what I mean about considering other approaches to addressing some of these really intractable problems that we're facing in terms of food security. The other issue, I'd just like to come back to that of if it's okay for humans, is it okay for animals? If you could turn off stress, the stress response in humans, so for example, they would go and fight as soldiers without fear, or you could get them to live in really crowded conditions without having any negative affective emotions. Would that be all right? That's a question. I don't have the answer.
Yeah, that's actually a very complicated question. What do you think, Professor Camargo?
Yeah, so about increasing the productivity. So as I said, if you increase the production of cows, you have an average example I mentioned before, for animal that can produce 6 liters of milk. If you increase 10%, 50%, you already have some cows that can produce 7, 8 milks, but just the frequency of those cows, the proportion of those cows is very low. So we can use technologies, not only gene editing. Gene editing is just one tool. You have several others. You can use all of them together. You can put them together. Again, as Dr. Frewer said, there's no one solution for milk producing. So, but you can use this. You can use animal management, increase animal health. Not only using genome editing. This would be another tool. If you have a solution without using this, good. That would be excellent. So this is a new tool in the box, right? You have to decide if you want to use it or not, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, well, do you think, because Professor Frewer said, and also you were saying now, should we use it, should we not use it? And I was wondering, what should be the limits, or are there limits to the instrumental uses of animals? So, and if there are, how should those be enforced? Because let's assume even we use gene editing, but are there any limits to this further instrumentalization, and how do we enforce them to make sure that maybe we don't go above a certain point, or where should we stop?
So it's quite difficult for me to say, how do we really bring together all of these different perspectives to reach a tipping point where regulation needs to kick in? I mean, first of all, I think we need to look at the available data to try and understand, if you like, this plurality of values that people hold around not only gene editing, but also the environmental impacts, the ecosystem service delivery associated with food systems, and how those trade-offs might operationalize. So that's one issue. The other issue that I'm going to bring in, which we haven't really mentioned, is if you increase supply, does that then have an impact on demand? And maybe not in the particular case that we're looking at here. Let's not consider the milk in LMICs. If we increase, for example, the red meat supply in the global food chain, and this is a controversial point for many, but then are we going to increase human health problems in the future? Or do we then introduce gene editing technology so that the meat that's being produced doesn't have that negative impact on non-communicable diseases, which is a further level of interference? So, my question is, it's not only at the level of considering supply and demand in a very local supply chain, it's also some of these broader issues of what we want from food security, from global food systems. And gene editing of animals is part of that broader picture.
Professor Camargo?
Yeah, it's hard to say the limits. We have the ethical limits. This comes first, I think. It's this is why people are not making cloning human, all this, and we have to also have the same ethical limits for animals. So if you want to use gene editing or any other technology, you have to consider this, right? For regulators, I think it would be hard to establish a limit. It depends. The regulation usually comes behind the problem, right? So this is but if you think if you can make laws to enforce them, as farmers, for instance, to avoid using a kind of technology, usually this is not a good solution, because they're still using it, because if they are having benefits on this, right? So what we need is to show to those farmers, for instance, or the consumers or everything, the difference between what is good and what is bad, but without any kind of how can I say that, very you have to wide your focus, right? Not to be too strict.
Yeah, actually, I have just one last question for our panelists, and then we're going to open the floor for questions from our attendees. So please get your questions ready, and we're going to address them soon. But I was also wondering if you think that increased intensification of animal agriculture supported by gene editing or other technologies may have an impact on the environment, and if so, how, and if we should manage it.
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay, it's my personal view. I don't have the data to support it. I think we should be really careful about increased intensification, although sometimes extensification may also have an impact on the environment in which it's occurring. But we need to monitor the situation. So in terms of environmental impact, you have different sorts of ecosystem services that you can, biodiversity, bundles of biodiversity, the aesthetics of the landscape, as well as how that supports productivist values, producing food that we need. So I think it's very difficult to say we should or we shouldn't, My personal view is that we have to consider a range of future scenarios. And as I've said before, the plurality of values, the different values, which may not be economic, which will drive those scenarios, and then co-produce with our stakeholders, with the public, preferred approaches and regulations to try and get the best world we can. There's a slight caveat here in that what we think today may be not what we think in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. I don't know what the solution to that is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you mention intensifications, again depends where you are. You know, there's no reason to increase the intensification for milk production or meat or even chicken in Europe and US. You know, because they have a large productivity. They have and already have problems with this kind of intensification. But when you move to some other countries where the productivity is very low, you have a lot of animals, a lot of cows producing nothing, just putting methane emission, increase the methane emission on this. So for those countries, for those nations, we can work. Maybe we can work to increase the production for those animals. Not only gene editing. Gene editing is tool. I think the gene editing will not be the difference. You know, it will not make the difference. Gene editing. It can increase maybe 5%, 10%, and it will work only if all other tools also works well, right? But for those example, when like Africa, we had a lot of even here in Brazil from dairy farms, a lot of cows. If instead of have 10 cows to produce 20 kilos of milk, I can have maybe 5 to produce 30 liters of milk. So the picture is different from when you compare to Europe and other countries. So it's not. So you have to think exactly where you are going to work.
Yeah. Thank you so much to you both. And now, with the remaining time that we have, let's open the floor for questions.
Anyone has any questions?
Thank you so much for the conversation. It's very, very interesting. And to probably like one of those last points that Professor Camargo was raising is like, how do you see agroforestry and silvopasture as a way to improve productivity, especially for small holder or small farmers, while also like improving environmental services without like going to genetically modified or like doing some of this technology? What are your takes and how do you see these evolving in Brazil and like the tropics in general?
Yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, actually, the interaction between forest and crops and farm, I think that is the question, right?
And for instance, like silvopasture, like here at Yale, many times it's like very mentioned, like Colombia has been doing a lot of research on that, but adoption is low, and that's sometimes seen as like a good way to increase productivity without having to use or to change genes and so on and so forth.
I think that's one of kind of way to improve animal production. You can have the trees be shadow. You can reduce the heat stress on some animals. You can keep the forest not the same density, right? Like a native forest. So this is not to be used in like Amazon or something like that, but in a region that you need a forest, you can also use the animals. You can also use some crops. But there is a lot of research on that to use the silver in animals. We call this interaction INPF, forest and interaction animal.
Yeah, Professor Frewer, I saw you have your hand raised.
So, I mean, the point I was going to make is that I work on agroforestry in Northumberland, but some of my colleagues are working on some of these agroforestry schemes in sub-Saharan African areas. And actually, they're really successful because there are different cultures of people that live within this new agroforestry area. And it's not just animal production, it's also intercropping with arable or whatever. The impact on ecosystem service delivery is great. But what you're not getting is this increase in production. So you wouldn't get more milk necessarily. You might get better quality milk, but it's a trade-off between the benefits and the concerns about what you're trying to do. So sorry for chipping in there. My response is that I think agroforestry offers fantastic solutions to multiple problems, but it might not be an increase in animal protein in the food supply.
Yeah, Professor Camargo, please.
Yeah, just to say that's interesting, the experience in Africa, because here in Brazil, we have been using this. There's people doing one effect is increase milk production. This is maybe we can have a kind of different cattle, because what we people have been seeing here is when you use this interaction, this forest and we have less heat stress, so we have high fertility from those animals, though they can produce more milk during their lifetime because they can get pregnant earlier. So you can, with less head stress, you can improve milk quality, as Dr. Frio said. But here people have been noticed that can also increase milk. It's not a huge increase. It's not that what you want, also a huge increase, but it can improve maybe 10, 8, 10, 15%.
So I think it's very dependent on the context. But I think the other point is from a welfare perspective, it's probably a lot better for the animals. So it's not just about production, it's about all of these other values which contribute, well, to good things in the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Any other question? No? Okay. Well, okay.
Hello. Thanks so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask, just to learn more about if there were to be gene editing of animals' stress reactions, what sort of methodology is even used to help humans assess and understand what the response of the animals is in that context?
I think animal emotion is an area where there's a huge research gap. Understanding animal emotion is something that we don't really understand, whether that's companion animals or whether it's production animals or whether it's animals existing in the wild. I think one of the problems in the past is that we haven't really addressed the methods that adequately can assess what those animal emotions are. I know you can use, you can assess this through looking at their hormones, through their change behavior patterns and so on. But I think it's an area which requires a lot more research funding, particularly in relation to animals where we exploit them in different ways.
Yeah. I think that's just to mention one point, that's we are when we've speak about gene editing. You can use genome editing for different purpose, right? For the one example, the two examples I showed it here, we can get those alleles in different animals, making the a crossbreeding one. So, but this take a long time because the generation interval. I think, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good. So it depends. One thing that's interesting to mention is that one way to use the genome editing, the way I showed you here, is this we were gonna have the same result if you cross the animals. So in that case, maybe it's not, maybe not too how can I say that? Will not be a big problem, you know, because if you cross different breeds, you have alleles moving between those animals, right? So you can use gene editing to move those specific alleles. I mean, just one base is C and T, G and E. So you can do this when you use the genome editors. You can do 1 or 2 generations instead of 8 to 10 or 15 generations. But if you want to use genome editing for other kind of purpose, when you want to introduce any a new trait, I mean, that is not in the species, is not in the breed, that one thing that we should think, you have to think if it's ethical or not. I'm not saying that it is not ethical to use genome editing to move just one base that's already in the breed. We still have to think about that, you know. But if you want to move or create a new trait in a species or that I think this we have to think if it's worthy or not.
Thank you so much. I think we have 1 minute left. Is there any final question?
I don't think there's any more question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, then I think we are out of time, but thank you so much to our panelists for this fantastic presentation and to share their knowledge with us. And thanks the organizer, and thank you, Weiji, for helping me out with the Zoom everything. And also especially thank you to you all for coming in and your interesting question. And please, one more big round of applause for our panelists.